Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. From Eden to eternity, the Bible tells one big story of redemption. My name is Tiffany, and I want to spend a few minutes with you every day walking through the Bible chronologically. Together, we will explore God's sovereign plan as the events of Scripture unfold and point to Jesus. Hi, friends. Welcome back to our Year in the Bible journey. Tiffany here, and today I'm excited because we will be incorporating a psalm into our study. It's our first time to see how the events of another place in Scripture fit into our current timeline. So let's take a look at Numbers 13 through 15 and see how these chapters help us better understand Psalm 90 and vice versa. We ended yesterday with the nation of Israel camped at Kadesh Barnea in the wilderness of Paran. From this location, God strategically placed the nation for their invasion of the Promised Land. But first, God tells Moses to appoint 12 men to scout out the land, one man from each tribe. But we don't want to miss that they were scouting out the land he was already giving them. God promised them victory before they even scouted the land. When Moses tells them to be courageous, they could be, because God had already provided the victory. Two of the scouts or spies we want to note are Caleb from the tribe of Judah and Hoshea from the tribe of Ephraim. It is here in Numbers 13 that Moses changes Hoshea's name, which means he saves, to Joshua, which means Yahweh saves. With 10 other scouts, the 12 set out on their 40-day journey. Let me encourage you once again to take some time to look at a map as you study. These men started at the southern tip of Canaan, worked their way up past the Sea of Galilee, and came back. They traveled over 500 miles in 40 days. For men on foot, that was a lot of ground to cover, but their journey was successful as they returned with the fruit of the land, having seen that it indeed was bountiful and beautiful. But when it came time to give their report, 10 of the scouts allowed their fears to get the better of them instead of trusting in God's promised victory. Their fear gave birth to a report that was filled with lies and exaggerations to persuade the nation not to enter the land. But Caleb spoke boldly and gave the charge to take possession of the land. With God on their side, they were assured success. But the fears of the 10 became the fears of the multitude. The nation complained and grumbled against Moses, and once again, they thought returning to bondage in Egypt was the better choice. Caleb and Joshua with him pled with the nation to remember that God had prepared the way. The Canaanites had no protection from the Lord, and he would bring his chosen people into the land just as he promised. The people's response was to attempt to stone Caleb and Joshua until God's glory appeared to them at the tent of meeting. Before we see what consequences await, it's important for us to realize that the very fears that prevented the 10 scouts and the nation from trusting God's promised victory are the same fears that we face today. When hardship and difficulty come our way, we are quick to question God and trust in our own judgment and observation, just as the Israelites did. But the Apostle John shares the absolute truth our hearts need in 1 John 4:4, which says, "The one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world." God's presence was with the Israelites. They had seen it, felt it, and worshipped before it. Yet their fears led them to believe the lies of Satan, that the bondage they knew was better than an unknown future they didn't. Satan wants us to believe that our bondage to sin is better too. But for followers of Christ, we have the very presence of God within us. Jesus has conquered sin and death, and through him we have been promised victory. We trust in the unknown because we know God is there. We trust in his plan because he sees and knows all. We know that the Lord is with us, and we have nothing to fear because our eternal home with him is secure. As God's glory appears before the Israelites in Numbers 14, he speaks to Moses and gives him a familiar offer. Back in Exodus 32, when the nation created the golden calf, God had offered to destroy the nation and start over with Moses. He does the same thing here in Numbers. God was ready to destroy these people who despised him and to make a great nation from Moses instead. But just as before, Moses makes the right choice by reminding God who he is and the promises he has made. But this time, he quotes Exodus 34, verses 6 through 7. God is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in faithful love. Moses' plea to pardon the people is heard, but the consequences are great. Those who were 20 years old and older at the time of the census would never enter the promised land. They would die in the desert, and their children would be the ones to possess the land. God also struck down the 10 scouts who incited the rebellion. But Caleb and Joshua were rewarded for their faithfulness, and they would enter the land with their families 40 years later. Like a small child who doesn't like their punishment, the Israelites try to make things right by sounding the charge to take the promised land. The very thing that had been so fearful was now more appealing than wandering in the wilderness until they died. But God was not with them, and they did not succeed. And it is here that we want to take a moment to chat about Psalm chapter 90. This psalm was written by Moses as a lament or prayer on behalf of the people. It was likely written following a disaster such as the golden calf incident, or here after Israel's rebellion. We don't know for certain which event, but the psalm was a reminder to the people that life is fleeting and only in God can we take refuge. This prayer or song was passed down from generation to generation as a song of remembrance and trust in who God is and what he has done for his children. The psalm teaches that we are to number our days carefully so that we develop wisdom. That wisdom can only come from God, who satisfies us with his love, his faithful love. From eternity to eternity, he is God. Numbers 15 might seem like an abrupt or strange shift in the narrative as we read about more laws concerning the offerings. But in actuality, it's a beautiful picture of God's faithfulness. In verse 2, God says, "When you enter the land I am giving you to settle in." Even though the generation that came out of Egypt wouldn't see the promised land, God was still going to give it to the nation. The promise was simply delayed. Even though the nation lacked faithfulness to God, God was still abounding in faithful love. The verses in this chapter instruct the Israelites that do enter the land concerning their sacrifices and offerings, the ones that we read about back in Leviticus. When the people take possession of the land, they will have more resources, and God outlines what and how they are to sacrifice. We also read about the blue tassels the nation was to wear on their garments. In this time period, tassels on clothing were only worn by royalty or the upper class, but all of Israel was to wear them in remembrance of God's commands and to designate them as his chosen people. Tomorrow, the wandering and rebellion continues, and so does God's judgment. But his faithful love is never far and always advances his plan of redemption despite mankind's failure. I'll see you tomorrow, friends, as we take a look at Numbers 16 through 18. See you then.